Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 116. This is for our class for Thursday, the 5th, where we have pretty much put some closure onto short story and our fiction section. And as you know, that means that you have a paper. And I suggest that you submit in the paper before the spring break. We actually have just 1 week left, believe it or not, before spring break, rather than after spring break, though it would be accepted after spring break. But the idea is that the sooner you can get it in, the better off you are, now that we have completed all of the options that you can write about in the fiction section. And I certainly accept early papers. But that said, you will see in the notes below that I have some information about writing papers. And if you'll remember, we covered some of this information at the beginning of the semester and some of the earlier set of readings that I had assigned from our textbook. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find those available online, but those early readings talk about the process of writing a paper and also talk about the idea of starting a paper earlier rather than later, which I always encourage, and even gives you an example of a sample paper. And what I wanted to do was to continue that with talking about a handout that I have uploaded into our syllabus and other documents folder. And as you know, I suggest that you might want to take a hard copy of the information in the syllabus and other documents folder, and it's entitled The Critical Paper, which is what you will be writing for this particular class. And this handout has a history because basically it was a handout that was distributed to me when I was an undergraduate. I've kept it all these years. I still think it's a great review of how to write a paper. And it's divided up into three portions. The first, the planning phase. And this is the phase that a lot of people skip. They go straight into the second phase, which is the writing. You're doing yourself a disservice because if you spend some time planning the prep work, if you will, then you can spend less time in the writing. And too many writers try to write the perfect first sentence and spend and waste a lot of time trying to do that rather than generating ideas, organizing those ideas into some sort of a form that you think you might want to discuss. And of course, this is just a draft, so you are constantly making revisions. But once you've got a general draft, then you can go back and polish the writing and try to write the perfect first sentence. Or, as I had a very wise professor in college once say, a paper's never done, you just have to hand it in at some point, which is quite true. And for you, the idea is that we've got approximately 4 to 5 pages, but as long or short as it needs to be, for you to practice your skills with either analyzing a short story or analyzing a film, which is how we began our fiction section. And the film choice you have is Citizen Kane. And the short story choices you have are the short stories that we covered over the course of the semester. And I've suggested a couple of paper topics, one in relation to canon and one in relation to contemporary relevance. And you can take either side of the debate, because it is a debate, that the text you've selected should be part of the canon, and then you would identify all those elements within the text that you think are canonical or that satisfy some of the criteria of canon, using both paraphrase, your own language, and also quotation, word for word quotes from the text. Or you might want to talk a little bit about contemporary relevance. Same sort of idea, it's debatable. So you could take either side, and what you would do is identify those elements in the text that you think do or perhaps do not have contemporary relevance, because you have the option of writing about something that you think should be in the canon or should not be in the canon, or something that has contemporary relevance or doesn't have contemporary relevance. The contemporary relevance piece is a little bit more complex in the sense that contemporary relevance is usually a criteria of canon, but there are oftentimes other criteria as well. And there should be other criteria as well, not just contemporary relevance, to determine if something is worth academic study. which is what scholars and critics do when they try to determine if something is canonical. Of course, with also contemporary relevance, it's very easy to focus on our current time and forget that you are analyzing the text. Remember that your focus should be on the text itself. And I see this paper as a learning exercise that you actually have to do it. And I will review it, return it back to you. If you are content with your grades, you're done with the assignment. But if not, you can rewrite it for a higher grade, taking my comments into account. And I ask that you submit in that revision along with your original copy and my commentary on it before the ending of the semester, so you've got some time to do that. And all of the submissions are done through PDF to my email, which is how my grading program works best, which is ruiz, R-U-I-Z, @gcc.mass.edu. And I shall return that back to you. And in terms of thinking about our second paper, which isn't going to be due till the ending of the semester, same sort of exercise, just about a different text. In this instance, drama, which is the unit that we are shifting into. So the idea behind the second paper is that you're just incorporating what you learned in the first paper into the construction of the second paper. You're just writing on a different text. But getting back to the handout of the critical paper, and you'll see in the notes below that it talks a little bit about an introductory paragraph. And the introductory paragraph, the first paragraph of your writing, is perhaps particularly challenging because that's usually where you include your thesis, which is a statement or two that summarizes your particular position, something that's debatable. And then, of course, you spend your body paragraphs, the paragraphs that follow, supporting that particular thesis. So I'm hopeful that this is a review from your English 101 class. And just referencing the handout, when it talks about planning, before we actually start getting into some of the specifics of writing, it talks about your job is to analyze, not to summarize. The idea is that the audience, me and anybody else reading the paper, already has a familiarity with the text. So you don't need to retell the whole story. It's not what I call a junior high school book report. So basically, a grammatical way of saying that is confine your comments on plot to subordinate clauses, emphasizing the main clause's significance of that action. So you're discussing not what happened, but why those things happen. Of course, you're going to have to tell us a little bit about what happened, but you don't have to tell us the entire story. And that thesis needs to be specific. So you can't say something like, in Hamlet, Shakespeare explores the complexities of experience. That's so broad, it applies to every author in every situation. Just like saying something like Shakespeare employs much imagery in Hamlet, my response is just about every author employs much imagery in their text. The question is what imagery is employed and why. So oftentimes what happens is that someone isn't sure of what their thesis is when they begin writing. So write a draft, and then you can review what you've written, try to summarize it in one or two sentences, and then plug it into the introduction. So you don't necessarily have to write in chronological order. Your introduction also includes the name of the text and the name of the author, or if you're talking about film, the name of the director. And then you're spending your body paragraphs, in the plural, coming up with basically arguments to support that thesis. Note that each of your paragraphs, not just in the body, but in the introduction and the conclusion, got to be a minimum of 3 sentences long. So you have a beginning, a middle, and an end. They'll probably be a lot longer than that because each paragraph is basically dealing with a topic or an idea. But you don't want to write any 1 or 2 sentence paragraphs, even though you might see that in the media. But writing in the media or journalism is different than writing an academic paper, which is also considered the writing that you would do in the workplace, which is how this skill is transferable. And if you're writing well-written paragraphs, then the first sentence, which is known as the topic sentence, more often than not summarizes the main point of the paragraph. So if that is indeed the case, you should be able to read your first sentences, your topic sentences, and basically get a summary of the main points. Again, this doesn't have to happen for every paragraph, but it should happen for the majority of your paragraphs. Think of yourself almost like an attorney presenting a case in a courtroom. Think of me perhaps as a judge, that I'm not supposed to let my personal beliefs interfere with the ultimate result of the case. And a good attorney can argue guilty or innocent, defense or prosecution. It's just a question of which pieces of evidence do you highlight. And of course, the goal is to try to be as persuasive as possible with the pieces of evidence that you have. Sometimes you have a lot of evidence, sometimes you don't have very much evidence. That leads us to the conclusion, which can oftentimes be rather laborious because you've said everything and you're tired and you've run out of time. So definitely save a little bit of energy for the conclusion. Maybe you can save the conclusion for a place where you can make some impressive observation or hint at a related idea, or perhaps discuss briefly another work by the same author. So that said, we don't usually include autobiographical references to ourselves, but perhaps the conclusion could be a place that you could briefly do such a thing. And remember, what you're doing is analyzing the literature, much like we've been doing in class when we've been reviewing the pieces of literature. We just haven't had a focus. I've been talking about it in a very broad way, and the job of the thesis, the focus, is yours. So once you've done that writing, and I can't emphasize this enough, the first principle of good writing is economy. The second is simplicity. Say as much as possible in as few words as possible. So the goal is to be concise. In theory, you should finish your writing early enough so that you can go through it and ask yourself after each sentence, can I rephrase this in fewer words? And if so, chances are you should do so, even though that's going to reduce the length of your paper, but you'll end up with a stronger piece of writing. In fact, a lot of what I do when I'm evaluating a paper is deleting things, either because they're wordy, they can be said in fewer words, or they're redundant, it's already been said, or it's tangential, so it's not necessarily related to your thesis. So when we talk about page length, teachers are talking about ideas. So 4 to 5 pages of ideas, not necessarily 4 to 5 pages of words. And again, 4 to 5 pages is just a guesstimate for our class. Your paper should be as long or as short as you think it needs to be to support your position. However, 4 to 5 pages, double spaced, 1-inch margin, usually is the ballpark for being able to do that. So, in terms of how to be a strong writer, use verbs and nouns and adjectives and adverbs, descriptive words. Don't overuse them. Don't use them because you're trying to pad the paper. Certainly descriptive words are useful, but there isn't any reason to give us multiple synonyms, words with the same meaning, just so that you can add length to your paper. Vary your sentences. So you should have a mix of short sentences. You should have a mix of long sentences. Too many short sentences, the paper sounds choppy. Too many long sentences, the paper sounds dense. So you want to have a mixture of it. And you may want to think about your sentence beginnings. Look at the beginnings of your sentences, especially those sentences that appear right next to each other. And they should vary. You should not have multiple sentences that are next to one another that all begin with the same word. You might remember Citizen Kane at one point. Leland says that actually to Kane is that's another sentence that you started with the word I when they're talking about his declaration of principles. And Kane says that he wants to repeat his sentences starting with I because he wants everyone to know who is responsible. But what Leland is suggesting, which is what I'm suggesting, is that this is bad writing style to have multiple sentences beginning with the same word if they're next to one another. So some random notes. Avoid cliches, which are overused expressions. The grass is always greener on the other side of the lawn, for instance. When we get to Shakespeare, we will find, interestingly, that many of these cliches that we use in everyday language were originally written by Shakespeare. But at the time, they were original. But now they're so overused. In other words, the everyday person is quoting Shakespeare all the time, not even realizing it. But more on that later. And you also want to avoid slang, which is usually specialized language that's created by a group to exclude another group. It's considered informal or non-standard language. It's what every generation of teenagers does to try to exclude adults from understanding what they're saying. And yes, sometimes slang becomes mainstream and everybody starts using it. But the idea is that it's not considered to be standard. And the reason why we have these rules is just because there's a greater possibility for misunderstanding. So, for instance, imagine if English were not your first language. How difficult it would be to understand some of these cliches or tried or overused expressions, such as it's raining cats and dogs. What do cats and dogs have to do with rain? Worse, we put dogs before cats without, or cats before dogs. It's raining cats and dogs. And if anybody were to say it's raining dogs and cats, they'd probably be corrected because that's just not the way we say it. And yet, there isn't any good rationale for that. So it just leads to a greater possibility of misunderstanding or confusion. And at this point in the semester, I always give a real life story to reinforce this point. And I warn you right now, it does not have a happy ending. And this occurred in the 90s, so you can look it up if you wanted to, that a second language English student was going to a party, and he went to the wrong home, a home that had been burglarized previously. So shall we say that the owner was nervous. And when the owner opened the door and the student asked, "Is this where the party is at?" the owner responded with a slang term I suspect most, if not all of us know, which is freeze, which means to stop. But for whatever reason, whether the student misheard, misunderstood, that student took a step forward, which is the opposite of freezing. And the owner of the house responded by pulling out his gun, which he always wore, and shooting it off and killing that student on his doorstep. True story. And I use this to illustrate about the dangers of misunderstanding. It actually changed the way languages were taught in classrooms, too. That you need to know what we say, the language of the streets, just as much as you need to know academic language, because we speak differently than we write. But the reason why we write differently is so that we can lower the possibility of misunderstanding. So avoid cliches and avoid slang. And also keep in mind that the dash is something that you use sparingly. The dash is just a long pause, almost like the pause you take before you get to the punchline, let's say, of a joke. Um, so you could oftentimes use a comma in place of a dash. The dash is just a longer pause and it reinforces and highlights what comes afterwards. So use sparingly, just like the semicolon is used sparingly. The semicolon basically connects two complete sentences or two complete ideas. And rather than a period between them, the way we would normally punctuate when we're writing sentences, if we were to use a semicolon, what we've got basically is a long pause rather than a stop, which is what the period is. And you use the semicolon to show that two sentences are related to one another. And of course, the assumption is that if two sentences appear next to one another, they are connected. They have some sort of relationship. But by using the semicolon, you're reinforcing that particular relationship between the two. So I don't know if peer tutoring is still using this example when it has handouts about the semicolon. But basically, we have two very simple sentences. I love apples, they are delicious. We could put a period between the two, and that would be considered quite standard. However, if we were to put a semicolon there, we are reinforcing the idea that these two sentences are connected with one another. That the reason why you love apples is because of their taste. They're delicious, as opposed to their being readily available, for instance, or being nutritious. The thing with the semicolon is just like the dash. You use very sparingly or else it loses its impact. So once or twice in a paper, let's say, not once or twice in a paragraph. But I know that the dash and the semicolon oftentimes present challenges to writers. So I wanted to talk about that. And something that seems completely counterintuitive, but let me explain why we do this. You want to maintain the present tense when you're talking about a text, such as Citizen Kane or one of the short stories we've read. And I'm well aware that the text was written in the past. And I'm well aware that you watched it or read it in the past. So you're going to be tempted to talk about it in the past tense. Talk about it in the present because it universalizes it. So it wasn't that Citizen Kane said to Leland, it's that Citizen Kane says to Leland, as if it's actually happening right now. And then, of course, proofreading. And ideally, you would set your paper aside for days, but at the very least for a few hours, and then try to go back to it with a fresh eye. If you have difficulty proofreading, try reading backwards. So you start at the end, let's say page 5, and you work to the beginning. Of course, it won't make sense. The idea is that you can focus on some of the specifics that you might have missed because your brain oftentimes sees something different than what is on the page. Also, read your paper out loud. A lot of times you can hear mistakes and rectify them that way. It's almost like hearing a wrong note played in music, and even though you don't know how to read music, you know something wrong occurred. And as long as you can correct it, you don't really need the language to explain what occurred. And it's the same with writing. Unless you're going to be an English teacher, don't necessarily need to have the language. If you can hear something with your ear that's incorrect, and then you would correct it. Your paper should have a title. Your paper title should be original. So you should not call your paper Young Goodman Brown if it's about Young Goodman Brown. That title's already been taken. Now, you can incorporate the title, the text, within your own title. So you could talk about something like ambiguity in Young Goodman Brown. But again, your title has to be original. And we do have conventions to let a reader know if the text you're talking about is shorter, in it, for instance, a poem or a short story, or longer, let's say something like a novel or a drama or a film. So if it's shorter, you put it in quotation marks. And you might have noticed that the titles of the short stories in our fiction section, I've put in quotation marks, deliberately so, to indicate that they are short stories. If it's something that's longer, you either put it in italics, that title, but the problem with italics is if you are handwriting, let's say on a whiteboard, you can't really write in italics, so you underline it. So you either put it in italics or you underline it. And again, all of this is in that handout. You don't have to underline your title in its completeness, just the text itself. Again, identify the author and the work someplace in the first paragraph. And to show you how old this particular handout is, it says instructors prefer typewritten papers. Obviously, your paper has to be typed, double-spaced with 1-inch margins, and that information is also included on the syllabus. And I'm asking for a title page, which is just a separate sheet of paper or a separate screen, if you will, if you're submitting electronically, which you would be, that lists the title of the paper and gives some information such as your name, my name, the due date. And there isn't any standardized form about how to format that, though I can tell you that most writers will put the title someplace in the middle of the paper, and then in the lower right-hand corner will include their name and my name and the due date. And a couple of other points in terms of writing tips. Avoid the use of I will argue, is considered to be wordy, redundant. You don't necessarily have to say that. You could easily take out, I believe Mrs. Mallard feels free, and just say Mrs. Mallard feels free. Contractions. When we take two words and contract them into one word, we use contractions all the time. So instead of saying do not, we say don't. Instead of saying cannot, we say can't. Now, I was taught in a very formal way. The best way to proceed would be to avoid contractions because that's a little bit more formal. So say do not or cannot or will not. And I suppose if you were ever desperate enough about length, that would give you a few additional letters. I hope you're never desperate that way. So I recommend that you avoid contractions. There's nothing grammatically wrong with them. If I do see a contraction in your writing, yes, I will circle it or underline it, but it won't impact your grade. And of course, something like what we're talking about needs to have some kind of documentation because you are referencing the text. So I wanted to talk a little bit about using documentation after you've written the paper, which has an introduction, which are thesis, name of the text, name of the author. Again, 3 or more sentences. Each of your body paragraphs. And basically, each paragraph is usually devoted to a different topic. Again, 3 or more sentences. Again, usually paragraphs have a topic sentence, a line that summarizes what the sentence is about. And then finally, a concluding paragraph that gives a sense of closure. So, in terms of documentation, there are lots of systems in place for how to document quotation, how to give the reader information about where to find the quote so they can verify its authenticity. And again, I'm hopeful that this is something that you've already discussed in English 101, so it's a review. So basically, in terms of documentation, we use in the humanities, and that includes literature classes, the system of MLA, which stands for Modern Language Association. So those are the rules that you're supposed to be following. This is the professional organization that makes the rules for what is considered to be acceptable when you are, for instance, writing about literature. There are other systems, such as APA, American Psychological Association, and those are for the sciences. So you don't want to mix them up. So what might be correct for the sciences wouldn't necessarily be correct for, let's say, an English class, and vice versa. And the MLA system, the system we're using, uses what we call parenthetical documentation, which is just a fancy way of saying that immediately after the quote, we use parentheses. And within the parentheses, we indicate the least amount of information necessary so the reader can identify where that quote appears, whether it's a book or magazine article or a website and so forth and so on. And there's some examples of this in the notes below under the second section. And basically what is usually the least piece of information is a page number. So the first example we're given, punctuation after documentation. Quote, Krebs went to the war from a Methodist college, unquote. Open your parentheses and you see a number there, 162, close parentheses, and then we have our ending punctuation. 162 references a page number. So you don't have to write the word page in there or PG or P or anything like that. And if it was more than one page, you could just put a dash in the number. So it could be 162-163 if you needed to. If you aren't ready to complete your sentence, and again, remember punctuation goes after the parentheses, just continue your sentence and then put your closing punctuation, which is the second example and the second section of the handout. Quote, although Krebs went to the war from a Methodist college, unquote, open parentheses, 162, close parentheses, he cannot pray with his mother, period. Now, you do have the option of inserting yourself into a quote. Usually an insertion occurs because you need to clarify something immediately. You're not commenting on the relevance of the quote. Basically, you can do that before or after the quote. It's almost like interrupting somebody when they're speaking. So you need to have a very good reason for doing it. And the way we would do that is by using square brackets. And you can see that in the notes below in that second section about documentation. In insertion, it says, quote, even his, and then in square brackets is the name Krebs's, and then I close square brackets, lies were not sensational. and then closing quote, and then we've got parentheses, and of course page number and parentheses, and after parentheses we have closing punctuation. The word or words that appear in the square brackets in the quote, in this instance Krebs, were inserted by me or by the author of the paper, not the author of the text. So that's how you know if this is not an exact quote. And again, you don't insert yourself randomly because you want to comment on the relevance of the quote. You would do that before or after the quote itself. But if you need to clarify something, oftentimes it's a pronoun that, based on the sentence that you've selected to quote, the pronoun is unclear. It could reference multiple characters. So in that particular instance, for instance, the example I gave you, the pronoun is his, and we have Krebs and his father in that particular short story, as well as a few other minor characters who are male. So in terms of clarifying, I put in square brackets Krebs so that everybody is clear as to which character is being referenced. And you don't need to begin or end a quote with a square bracket because you get to decide where to start your quote and where to end your quote. And it could be mid-sentence where you start it or end it. That's fine. And keep that in mind if you're ever going to omit something from a quote, because there's a way to do that as well. And this is if you are omitting something between the start point from where you started quoting and the end point for where you've ended quoting. So it's not that something appeared before the quote. Of course, lots of things appeared before the quote. And it's not that something appeared after the quote. Of course, lots of things appear after the quote. It's between your start and stop point. If you decide to leave something out, we use something called an ellipsis, which is 3 periods or 3 dots, and you can see the example below under omission. And what those 3 dots indicate is that at that place, you've left out a word or several words. So you're not doing it to change the meaning of the quote. You're just doing it because it's not relevant to whatever it is that you happen to be quoting. I have 2 excellent websites for you to review. And again, I'm hopeful that this is also a review for you. And you'll see this in the second section of the notes below. One is Purdue OWL, and it is devoted to the entire writing process. It's from Purdue University, actually, but they've made it accessible to the public as a public service. And it goes through the process from how do you generate ideas to the very ending, how do you edit and proofread before you submit in a paper and what the final paper should look like. And specifically, Purdue OWL has an entire section just on quoting. Because the way the system works with quoting is that in the parentheses, yes, you put the least amount of information, but sometimes a page number is not enough because you might have, let's say, lots of text that you are referencing, and it's unclear which text you're referencing. So in that instance, you might have to give the author's last name in the page number. And if you've got multiple texts by the author, you might have to give part of the name of the title and the author's last name and the page number in parentheses. Whatever is necessary so the reader can know which text you're using. And then the way all of this comes together is in a works cited page where at the ending of the paper you literally list all of the works that have been cited, that have been quoted, and you do so by author's last name in alphabetical order. And there's a particular way to do that. So there's a particular way to format a book that would be slightly different from a website, from a magazine article, and so forth and so on. So you probably did this in your previous English class when you were writing a research paper. But keep in mind that I'm asking you to write a critical paper. I'm asking you not to use outside resources. So this simplifies things. As far as I'm concerned, you do not need to write a works cited page. Certainly you're invited to, and if so, you want to do it correctly. And again, you can find examples in our textbook and in Purdue OWL, for instance. But my assumption is that you've already learned how to write a works cited page, so you aren't going to need to submit in a works cited page. That said, if you're using outside resources, you have to submit in a works cited page. But to have all of you cite the textbook, which I'm well aware of because I ordered the book, to me seems a bit silly unless you want the practice with writing a works cited page. That said, you do have to use parenthetical documentation, which means that you are using parentheses after the quote, and then in the parentheses, you are giving some information about where that quote appears. Of course, electronic resources have made things a little bit more complicated, but the MLA came up with some rules for that as well, which basically is using the author's last name in the parentheses. And then in the works cited, you would cite the website, and there's particular information that you would utilize to do that as well. So that said, for us, I understand that people are using different editions. You don't necessarily need to do a works cited page if you're using a different edition. I'm certainly familiar enough with the quotations so that I would know if the quote is valid or not. But you should be practicing using parenthetical documentation that immediately after the quote, in the parentheses, you've got some information about where to find that particular quote so someone can verify its authenticity. And when it comes to film, what we end up using in this situation is a timestamp, because obviously you can't use a page number, for instance. So the timestamp would help an individual find the exact time that the quote is stated in the film so that they could verify again its authenticity. And as you know, I've provided links, but there are lots of ways that you can access these films as well. So the GCC library has hard copies with also transcription or closed captioning, and you can do interlibrary loan. You can stream from various streaming services, but I attempt whenever possible to try to find a free link if I can. And it may not necessarily have closed captioning, but I also try to provide text. So the screenplay, for instance, if it's available online, just so that you can read it while you're also watching if you so wanted to. So I'm aware of the time. I was going to begin talking about drama, and I think what I'm going to do is wait until next class. And basically, we're entering into a new unit. The good news is that drama is similar to what we've discussed with fiction in terms of techniques for reading. There are some small differences, but this is where we can catch up on some time. I wanted to talk a little bit about the elements of drama and prepare us for the drama that we are going to be reading in its entirety as our first major drama. So that's Oedipus the King. So I'm just going to wait on that. And you can see that in the notes below in section 11, I've got some drama unit links. So I've got links for Oedipus the King that I was able to find so that you can read it online if you wanted to. I also have a link for Midsummer Night's Dream, which is our second full drama. And I have a link for Raisin in the Sun, which is our third full drama. Oedipus the King is included in your textbook. Sadly, A Midsummer Night's Dream and Raisin in the Sun is not included in the most recent edition of the text, though it might be included in some of the older versions of the text. And as we will discuss with dramas, it's important to not just read a drama, but to see it perform. So we will watch performance as well. And of course, since this is an online class, we're not going to watch a live performance. We're going to watch a filmed performance, which works very nicely for a film and literature class because we're talking about film. So that is one of the reasons why when we get to the drama sections, we have multiple classes devoted to the dramas, because we need to discuss the drama. We need to also watch performance of the drama and then talk about both. So we have fewer things to read and see, but they're longer in nature. So that's what the drama section is going to be about. And that's what your second paper will be about these upcoming dramas with the same possibilities of paper topics. Though, of course, you can create your own. And that would be submitted in that paper by the ending of the semester. But, of course, early papers are encouraged. But more on that later as we transition from fiction into drama. But for now, you should be thinking about your paper. Again, I think it's ideal if you can hand it in before the spring break, which would be a week from today, believe it or not, would be our last class before spring break. And today's attendance question, which is going to be due on Saturday the 7th. And as you know, if you need an extension, please ask for one, and I will give you one. And the idea is that you are encouraged to respond to your peers, much like you would be in a face-to-face class, but you're not required to. What you are required to do is to read all your peer responses and my responses in turn. And this will give you a good idea of what we would have talked about in class. So that's really the second half of class, if you want to think about it that way. And the discussion forum questions are once again about paper number 1. Do you have any questions about paper number 1? And if so, what are those questions? And if you don't have any questions, you can just say, I don't have any questions, and you're done with the exercise, and that would satisfy your attendance for that particular class. But next class, I will talk about drama. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue our next class. Take care. Bye-bye.